Welcome to Alan's Italy. This show is going to focus on the Peggy Guggenheim Museum in Venice, which is one of the great museums I think it's one of the great museums in the world, and certainly it's one of the great museums in Italy. To help us talk about this amazing place, I have with me Sevan Melikyan.
Right. Well, how are you?
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for taking the time to do this.
My pleasure.
Sevan has a really wonderful presentation that will give us a real great look at this really amazing museum. First, let me ask you, how did you take an interest in this particular topic?
Well, I started a gallery about 4 years ago, and I was reading about gallerists to learn how to become a gallerist, and one of the famous gallerists, I guess, in the history of art is Peggy Guggenheim, and she was such a creative one. She's done things in a very unconventional ways that it was very inspiring. And interestingly enough, the gallery that I started did not. It was on the second floor of a barn. It's upstate New York. And there were no suitable walls to hang art in a conventional way. And after you find out about Peggy Guggenheim, you also learn that she had devised, through the help of the designer, a way of presenting art that did not require them to be hung on walls. They were kind of floating. They were suspended in a creative way. And that, just the thought that that was possible, it was okay to do that, made me think in a form of engineering where I could present the work suspended on wires coming from ceiling to floor. And that's why the name of the gallery became Wired Gallery, because it used wires. And that's certainly directly related to Peggy Guggenheim and her gallery.
So, in other words, we should mention the Wired Gallery, located in High Falls in New York State. A wonderful gallery. So, you conceived the idea of the gallery, and then looked around for people to emulate. Is that how it went, or did you first discover Peggy Guggenheim and then say, "Hey, that's a great. I would like to be that"?
Well, I can't really remember the sequence of things, but I believe I was aware of Peggy Guggenheim and all that, but when the opportunity came for me to have a show, it's not even a gallery, just do a show on top of a barn. So I quickly read a bunch of things at that moment, and I find out about this odd way of hanging, and I was trying to figure out at that point how to show the art, and then I came up with this idea. It's a stimulating thing because she came up with this creative way of presenting work, which actually didn't start. Right. It's not like art is being presented the way she did in her gallery. It was just almost an installation in the way we use the word installation in art. It was very critical. But nevertheless, my gallery and Peggy Guggenheim are very connected.
They are. So, but Peggy Guggenheim's museum was her own private collection, as opposed to Wired Gallery, which is really this traditional kind of gallery with monthly shows and so on.
Well, Peggy Guggenheim is a very odd creature in the history of art collectors or art dealers. She's a unique case in many ways. First of all, she's a woman, which is a rarity in the field to begin with, especially during that period. What Peggy Guggenheim was actually a collector. She wasn't a gallerist per se. She found herself in the world of art She acquired a lot of works. She opened the gallery. It was a natural thing to do, but it was a path to get to having her own museum and showing off her collection, these pieces that she bought over a period of time with the help of many great artists and advisors. So I am not a collector, and and my last name is not Guggenheim, and it's kind of Melikyan. So it's a big difference. In other words, she comes with a lot of resources, and her character is such that she wants to make a difference. She's not a creative person in many ways. She's not a business woman in many ways. So she's kind of stuck. So what can she do with all this money? Right. And still be associated with art, with artists, and also be at the level of her name. That name has a lot of gravitas and possess. So there is, like we say in French, noblesse oblige. She has to do something great with that name.
Yes.
So she's got all this money. She's friends with artists that she believes are going to make posterity, make immortality, and a natural way is for her to devote this money to buy art, to collect work, but also to be their patrons. In other words, to give them sums of money on a monthly basis, and provide them with the financial resources so that they can create, regardless whether she keeps the art or the art is sellable. So her role is much greater than any of these things. So it's an interesting case, Peggy Guggenheim.
Well, it's interesting to me too because it reminds me of the Medici Garden, the sculpture garden in Florence. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Lorenzo il Magnifico had a garden where he invited sculptors to come and simply do their work, and he paid for them and he paid for their room and board, and he said, just do what you want and I will, and I'll maybe keep your work, maybe I'll sell it, I don't know, but just come here, do your work. And
well, I think it's what's similar perhaps is that the Medicis, they also knew that being associated with great art, great artists will give them a certain
standing in the community.
Standing in the community, right. And they knew about the level of immortality you get by associating yourself with great artists.
Right.
So there's perhaps the only common thing between the two.
And you've been to Venice itself.
Of course. I mean,
once,
the only reason,
twice.
frankly, I went there was to visit the Guggenheim collection.
Right.
And the gondolas and the canals and all the rest to me was kind of icing on the cake.
Yes.
The main reason, really, and the hotel that we chose, I can't remember the name, of course, but it was just walking distance, despite that I got lost just getting to the
Yes, everybody gets lost in Venice.
It's like a maze. I mean,
you're supposed to get lost in Venice. That's the charm of it. You get lost and then you try to find your way.
Well, I think some people never get out of it because they just
can't find their way out.
They
and
fall
some
in love with
people
it.
say they can't find their way out, but because they don't want to find their way out. So that's okay.
This is also interesting with Peggy is that she didn't get out of there. She chose to stay there because Venice is this jewel where in some time in your life you just want to be there and have a great time, enjoy the beauty and all this craziness, and then get out.
Yes,
it's a place of passage more than really place of where you can make your living. It's such an odd place. I mean, who would think of just moving to Venice?
Well, but considering where she lived.
She lived in New York. She lived in London.
No. I mean, the house that she chose or that she created in Venice is not an ordinary house or a hotel. This is a magnificent piece of property right on the Grand Canal.
Palazzo.
Okay, so let's begin. So we're going to now I'm going to now turn it over to you, and you are going to give us your walkthrough of the Peggy Guggenheim collection experience.
So I took a bunch of pictures during my visit. I complemented those pictures with others that I found on the internet. So if any of you see some of your pictures, you know where it came from. It came from this huge resource called internet. My apologies if no credit is due.
Do it all the time.
And also, I also sent a friend to Peggy Guggenheim collection because I felt that some pictures were missing in completing the illustration I was looking for this talk that I gave a couple of times, and one in my gallery about the collection. So we can go through.
Okay, with that in mind, here we go.
So it's it's impossible to talk about the Peggy Guggenheim collection without talking about Peggy Guggenheim and her life. The collection is so closely associated with various episodes of her life and herself. So Peggy was born on August 26, 1898 in New York. And she was the middle daughter of three, Peggy, Hazel, and Benita. So the picture we're going to see here is of these three siblings from 1908. So her father was Benjamin Guggenheim, a handsome engineer, but a lousy businessman. And he was one of 11 children of the wealthy Guggenheim family. But he had left the firm long ago with his younger brother, William. So he didn't really share in any of the profits of the company after 1906. Although he had a huge income of over $250,000 a year, but also an extravagant lifestyle with homes in New York and Paris, and he had also several mistresses. So Peggy was her daddy's girl from childhood on, and she competed with her younger sister Hazel for her father's attention. After spending several years living in Paris, Benjamin had decided to come back to New York with one of his mistresses. Unfortunately, he books passage on the Titanic, and he goes down with the ship. And Peggy is 13 years old at that point. And the story goes that the night of the sinking, Guggenheim and his secretary are said to have assisted women and children with getting on the lifeboats. And they're all dressed in their finest. And he is remembered for saying, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." So in 1912, Peggy's father dies. After the First World War, she takes a job at an avant-garde bookstore in Greenwich Village. And her salary is all the books she can read. And that's where she has her first exposure to local artists, including Alfred Stieglitz and also Georgia O'Keeffe. And also ideas like communism. But Peggy always longs for Europe, and she set sail to France with her mother and a cousin in 1921. Apart from a few trips back, Peggy doesn't return full-time to the US, not until 1941. So at the age of 21, Peggy has an income of about $25,000 a year. She loves living in Paris. And Paris is really the place to be between the wars, particularly for artists, writers, etc. They could live cheaply. They could drink without having to worry about the prohibition that's happening since 1919 in the US. But, Peggy's still longing for more freedom. And she meets an artist named Lawrence Vale. And in Paris, he is an erudite, Oxford educated, a painter, a writer, and he's exact opposite in many ways, to what she's used to, because this is also a bohemian character. But he's absolutely no prize. He drinks a lot, throws tantrums, and sometimes is violent toward her. So, but Peggy has made up her mind to marry him, and in 1922, they get married. So soon after, they have 2 children, Sinbad and Pegeen. And there's a picture, this picture actually is showing them in Capri in 1922 during their honeymoon. And you can already see from the expression that the marriage is really not going to go very well. Actually, it's a complete disaster. So Peggy is in Paris, and she becomes friends with avant-garde writers and artists, and including Marcel Duchamp and the photographer Man Ray. And Man Ray took a series of the stunning pictures of portraits of Peggy Guggenheim, and here it is here. She already starts at that point to support several artists with monthly allowances, visual artists, but also writers. So Peggy also, you have to understand in her character that she's very self-conscious about her beauty or lack of beauty, especially her nose is a big issue. And in 1920, she tries to fix it through plastic surgery, one of the first times this is being experimented. And she's screaming out of pain while the procedure is being conducted. And she asked the surgeon, to stop in the middle of the procedure. So the surgery is botched, and I don't really know whether the end result leaves her with the worse nose than how she started. But nevertheless, she lives with this nose that she dislikes for the rest of her life. And some people think that her appearance, her looks, justifies or explains what she has done later on in art and with artists and with her promiscuity. So, as we know, she lost her father at age 13, and she's constantly on the lookout for a man to replace this father figure, but every time she's got the worst luck with them. So, of course, her husband is also, as I said, a disaster, and the two are going to end up divorcing. And they're going to have an unusual custody arrangement. Peggy is going to keep Pegeen, and Lawrence, the husband, is going to take the boy, Sinbad. And Peggy doesn't have a reputation for being a very attentive mother, just like her own mother. She's quite distant from attending to the needs of her children. Art and her friends seem to be more important. So Peggy is now about 40, and she already thinks practically that her life is over. And she's complaining about this to all her friends. And a friend of hers, by letter, encourages her to do some serious work, either in an art gallery or as a literary agent. This is what the friend recommends her to do. And Peggy chooses art as her life's work. And she makes her first purchase in 1937, and it's a sculpture called Tête et Coquille by Jean Arp, which is still in the Guggenheim collection today. So this is Tête et Coquille by Jean Arp. She also had her uncle Solomon Guggenheim as an example. He had purchased an incredible collection of old masters, and now his attention had turned to abstract art, like Kandinsky and Rudolf Bauer. Peggy didn't have the kind of money her uncle Solomon's had, so she decided to focus on modern art. And she enlisted the aid of her good friend, the artist Marcel Duchamp. So Duchamp becomes her mentor and guide for her gallery in London and also later in New York. Peggy had also inherited at that time an additional $500,000 on her mother's death. Now her income was going around $50,000 a year, which was enough for her to do a lot of purchasing. She was still, of course, patronizing artists and helping with allowances. So Peggy actually gives up all the social extravagances and purchasing expensive gowns and concentrating all her resources to buying art. So in 1938, she opens a gallery in London called the Guggenheim Jeune. And for 2 years, she runs this gallery showcasing artists that today you would see in all great museums. Jean Arp, Kandinsky, Yves Tanguy, and also having affairs with several of them as we go along. The gallery is a success artistically speaking. However, from a financial standpoint, it loses money. Actually, at the end of 2 years, she had lost £600. So she thinks about perhaps turning her collection that's growing or building a collection to open a museum rather than running a gallery. So she puts aside $40,000 for turning a space into a museum, but her plans are interrupted because the Second World War breaks out, 1939. And she's afraid that London is going to be bombed, so she decides to use those $40,000 to purchasing more art, and with no fear, which is quite amazing, she goes to Paris on an art shopping spree. She buys 10 Picassos. By the way, Picasso didn't like Peggy Guggenheim very much. She buys dozens of Marx Ernst, 8 Miros, 4 Magrittes, 3 Man Rays, 3 Dalis, 1 Paul Klee, 1 Chagall, etc., etc. And you can imagine that at that point, the artists are selling their works for very little, and the gallerists, often of Jewish descent, are leaving Paris and are not intervening in these dealings at all. So she goes directly to their studios and buying. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, she sets herself the goal of buying 1 piece of art per day as she stays in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
So the Germans are approaching. She leaves Paris and goes to the south of France. She meets up with Varian Fry, who's an agent sent by the U.S. government to save many artists, intellectuals, mostly of Jewish extraction, and have them exiled in the U.S. So she works with him to save several artists, including Marx Ernst. The other thing is that her collection needs to get out of France. So she approaches, and I believe it's Marcel Duchamp who suggests that, she approaches the Louvre Museum to have her collection stored, and the Louvre turns her down, assessing that her collection is not good enough, which is quite ironic when we know what the situation is today. So through various ways, she's able to get her collection out of France. It mixed with household objects and things like this, so the crates are completely mixed up, so nobody really suspects it to be all degenerate art, which is what the Nazis were looking for. So she arrives in New York in 1941, and her collection is intact, and she decides to open a new gallery, and it's called The Art of this Century. It used to be on 57th Street, 30 West 57th Street. The gallery is very interesting. It's 2 commercial spaces on the 7th floor of a building that was part of the Midtown Arts District. And you see there the Museum of Modern Art, not too far, and the Museum of Non-Objective Painting. And she gets also married with Marx Ernst at that point, partly because she wants to save Marx Ernst, who was German, and she's concerned about his safety, that if they are not married, perhaps he will be arrested. And Ernst didn't love her at all, because he only gets married to save himself. And the marriage lasts only 4 years, until the end of war. The other thing that was very interesting, we mentioned that earlier, is that the gallery is designed in such a way that it's groundbreaking in itself. You've got 4 distinct areas: the abstract gallery, the surrealist gallery, the kinetic gallery, and the daylight gallery. So in the abstract gallery, so that's where all the paintings are suspended. It's just a very creative way of displaying art. So what's happening at that point is that she has a collection of artwork by artists whose work are kind of behind them. She's not really dealing with artists who are contemporary and we've got a great potential. And she used to have salons in her gallery where you will have contemporary artists exhibit there, and she would always use expert advice from her friend. And Mondrian was the juror for one of the shows, and Mondrian selects two Jackson Pollock pieces, and Peggy Guggenheim was looking at those pieces, and you can imagine those are the drip paintings, and she goes to Mondrian and says, "These are absolutely horrendous, aren't they?" And Mondrian says, "This is some of the best work I haven't seen coming from American artists." And she's convinced so much that soon after, Peggy Guggenheim commissions Jackson Pollock to do huge canvas for her, for the entrance of her apartment. So she closes the gallery, and before she closes it, the count is that over 100 artists were seen, their works is exhibited there, which is a phenomenal number for those few years that she was in business. In 1947, she sails back to Paris. Now, in 1948, she's invited to show her collection at the Venice Biennale. And over there, she finds an unusual palazzo on the Grand Canal, and it's called Palazzo Venire dei Leoni. And she purchases it in 1949. It's a long, wide building with only a basement and ground floor, and it's left unfinished. And the nickname dei Leoni refers to the stone lion heads on the facade. And it even gave rise to the legend that a lion was once kept in the garden. So this is where she settles in. She sets up her collection and makes it her home for the following 30 years. And in 1951, Peggy Guggenheim achieves her dream by opening her home and collection to the public in the shape of a museum, which is free to visit. By the 60s, Peggy has all but stopped collecting art, apart perhaps from some African and primitive art. Most modern art is out of her price range, and she's not much interested either in the new artists like Andy Warhol or the pop art movement. She's surrounded by countless dogs.
Yes.
Whoever visits her cannot miss noticing that around her feet there is always dozens of dogs, small dogs, just keeping her company. At this point, she needs to worry about what to do with her collection after her death. At some point, she talks to the Tate Gallery in London, but that doesn't materialize to anything. And she decides to keep it in the family and donates the palazzo and the collection to the Solomon Guggenheim Museum. Her daughter Peggy was deeply dysfunctional, very depressed always, dies of a drug overdose in 1967 at the age of 42. And the palazzo, in the palazzo, she dedicates a small room to Peggy's art. And here is one of her pieces. It's called Girls in a Room, and it's from 1964. Usually people see in her work the combination of different artistic styles, mainly surrealism and naive art. So let's talk a little bit more about a few of the pieces that I've selected among many.
Mm-hmm, sure.
So as I said, those pieces were all chosen by Peggy, of course, with the help of some counsel. So here we have a Marcel Duchamp. It's titled Sad Young Man on a Train. Marcel Duchamp has a critical role in shaping Peggy Guggenheim's collection and into making her a historic figure in modern art. This piece is painted in 1911. The photograph that I have here is from 1912. He's 24 and already famous for painting pictures like Sad Young Man, but his most famous one is nude descending the stairs. So these are some of the shots from the interior of the museum. So let's visit this room where we see Clifford Steele's Jamais over the fireplace. So this is an early work of the American abstract expressionist. And this piece is actually also from an exhibit, the first exhibit, one solo show that he gave in Guggenheim's gallery. Of course, it's an abstract work, but it's been argued that Jamais depicts Persephone's mother, Demeter, searching for her daughter, who has been abducted to the underworld by Hades. So let's walk some more in the building, and we come to this room, and again above the fireplace there is Giorgio de Chirico's The Red Tower, painted in 1913. This is another enigmatic work by the Italian artist, a surrealist painting, dreamlike atmosphere, irrational perspective, a lack of unified light, kind of a silence, if it's possible to capture it in painting, a vacant setting. Also, it feels like something's going to happen. There are also some traces of concealed human presence, but it's hard to see it. If you look at the left side, you might suspect that someone is hiding there. Let's move some more. And this is Francis Bacon's study for chimpanzee, March 1957. And it could be the last, at least one of the last purchases of Peggy Guggenheim. She bought Francis Bacon. She had a hard time to choose something that didn't give her nightmares, according to her. So Peggy writes in her memoirs about this painting.
This was something that did not give her nightmares?
This is the one that did not give her nightmares.
Okay.
The rest of...
Because it's going to give me nightmares, I'll tell you that.
This is the gentlest of all the nightmarish pieces that Francis Bacon has produced. And this is what she writes. She says, "It depicts a very sympathetic ape seated on a chest, guarding a treasure, The background is all done in fuchsia colored pastel, which goes admirably with my turquoise walls and with a curtain made out of an Indian sari and a marabou bed cover of the same color. So she might be a collector, she might appreciate great art, but it still mattered that...
It's still important for the decor of her house.
Exactly. All right, so the next one is a Marx Ends piece. Marx Ends, a surrealist artist, beautiful, very handsome fellow, great charm, great success with women. He had this white hair and big blue eyes and a handsome beak-like nose that resembled a beautiful bird. And birds are often depicted in Marx Ends work. So this is called The Attirement of the Bride, La Toilette de la Mariée, 1940. So let's enter the Jackson Pollock room here, and we'll be focusing on a piece called Alchemy, one of Pollock's earliest poured paintings. And actually, on the right side, it's also Pollock. It's called The Moon Woman, and we could actually think from a distance that it's a Picasso.
I didn't think it was a Jackson Pollock.
I know. So this is The Moon Woman, 1942, and this is Alchemy. So obviously there is a world of difference between these two pieces, but they're only 5 years apart. Alchemy, uses this revolutionary technique of pouring art on a flat horizontal surface with tremendous control, and its contribution to 20th century art cannot be understated. So when you look at Alchemy from a distance, its large scale and even emphasis encourages the viewer to experience the painting as an environment. The textured surface is like a wall on which primitive signs are inscribed with white pigment squeezed directly from the tube. You can look at it, you can focus on the whites and see something, you can focus on the grays, you can focus on the blacks, you can choose any color and you'll realize that there's tremendous balance and harmony from a purely graphic standpoint. And the piece holds very well by itself, just as a whole. And this is what's the magic about these pieces. You can just spend a lot of time looking at them and find so much to follow, whether it's dynamism, whether it's the time that he took to pour it, whether it's the speed, whether you can see straight lines, whether you can see circles, or it's just it's an endless exercise in appreciation. Well, Peggy Guggenheim is certainly credited for discovering Jackson Pollock. For sure, she can definitely claim that fame. So I love the museum's cafe, which had many photographs from Peggy Guggenheim's life, and that we just saw here. And just before exiting, we can go on the terrace by the canal and enjoy the view, but also a very unusual sculpture. So it's on the courtyard, and it's actually a statue of a horse.
Is that Marino Marini?
Exactly. And so it's the statue of a horse and a rider, and the rider has his arms spread way out in some sort of ecstasy.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you were going to show the front.
It's there, and it's hard to miss it. And I guess to emphasize this ecstasy, Marino had added this phallus in full erection. But what was interesting about it is that you could take it off by unscrewing it.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so there were several instances where it became very handy to do that for Peggy Guggenheim.
Yes.
Like when the cardinal visited her,
Yes.
she definitely had to do that.
Groups of elementary school children as well,
And
probably.
nuns coming. So,
Yes.
but then sometimes she forgot to take it off, and she found herself in great embarrassment. So Peggy died in 1979 at the age of 81. So she was cremated and buried on the grounds of the palazzo, and along with many of her dogs. As you can see here, the plaques.
Yes. Yep.
Her plaque is just next to her dogs. There's a list of her dogs. And the museum reopened in 1980, a year after her death, under the new management of the Solomon Guggenheim Museum. And of course, the Peggy Guggenheim collection joined a host of Guggenheim museums around the world, including Bilbao, Berlin, Las Vegas, and of course, New York. And, just like the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, the artwork is displayed the very way Peggy designed and left it.
And that is Allen's Italy, show number 133, the Peggy Guggenheim Museum. And I'd like to begin by thanking Sevan for a really wonderful presentation on really what turned out to be the life and times and collection of Peggy Guggenheim. So that was really great. Normally, I would, whenever I do a show, I do a lot of editing and cutting out of things that I don't want and, working things around. And in this particular case, it was my intention to remove part of the presentation, which I thought may have been a little too long and probably is a little too long. But Sevan's presentation was just so wonderful that I decided to keep just about all of it exactly the way he did it when we videotaped it originally. So what you saw was exactly everything that we had done. What I want to show you now is the exact location of the Peggy Guggenheim Museum. And you see it now. This is an overhead shot of Venice. And you could see there's a circle and an arrow pointing to the Peggy Guggenheim Museum. And it's very easy to get there on a Vaporetto, which is a water bus. You can either get off at the Accademia Vaporetto stop, and then, looking at the map, it's kind of like a map. If you look at that picture, you can see that if you get off the stop and looking directly at it now, walk to the right, that's the Peggy Guggenheim. You could also get off at the next Vaporetto stop, which is called Salute, named after the Church of Santa Maria della Salute. And once you get off, then walk to the left, and the Peggy Guggenheim is right between the two Vaporetto stops. Very easy to get to. Now, what you're looking at now is the Wired Gallery. The Wired Gallery is the gallery that Sevan is the owner of. And it's a wonderful gallery in High Falls, and you can see what the house looks like. That's the gallery. And then you go in and you can see the rooms on the interior with some really wonderful art by some very, very talented artists in the area, mostly, but really great shows. And if you're ever in the area, or you can even make a trip to the area, that's a wonderful destination. And I'm showing you on this map basically where it's located and also the general vicinity. So it's not far from New Paltz, and it's really not far from Kingston and Poughkeepsie, and you just come up the New York State Thruway, and it takes about 2 hours. It's in a beautiful area, and if you make a trip, it's really a worthwhile thing to do. So that's the show. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you come back for future shows. And for now, buonanotte e buona fortuna.